All right, praise the Lord. It's a great subject, the 12 tribes, and we know that it's sort of the basis of pretty well everything we believe in the Bible, right through to Jesus Christ, is connected to the 12 tribes. When the Apostle Paul was before King Agrippa, at some point in his dissertation to King Agrippa, he mentioned the 12 tribes. James, who wrote the book of James chapter 1, verse 1, again, he mentions the 12 tribes. So he goes right through the Bible, right through the New Testament. And we know the book of Revelation has a lot to do with the 12 tribes as well, particularly the 144,000 and so on. So it's a big subject in the Bible. And I dare say the question we're asking today is what happened to them and where are they today? Okay, of course, it's the story of Abraham. Reading a few scriptures to start off with. Now the Lord has said unto Abraham, as his name was then, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show unto thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curseth thee, and in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. It obviously is not something that's just going to last 5 minutes, and this is something that's going to go right through to all the families of the earth. So chapter 17 goes on, and when Abraham was 90 years old and 9, and the Lord appeared to Abraham and said unto him, I am the Almighty God, walk before me and be thou perfect, and I'll make my covenant between me and thee, and I will multiply thee exceedingly. So it wasn't going to be just something local, it was going to spread out. Abraham fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant is with thee, and thou shalt be a father of many nations. Not just a local setup. Neither shall thy name any more be called Abraham, but thy name shall be called Abraham, which means the father of many nations have I made thee. And I will make thee exceeding fruitful, and I will make nations of thee, and kings shall come out of thee. The double part of this great message is the story of the 12 tribes and the story of the throne of David in particular. And I'll establish my covenant between me and thee, and thy seed after thee, in their generations, generation after generation, for an everlasting covenant, so should apply still today, to be a God unto thee, and thy seed after thee. So we jump a little bit further in the same chapter, and Abraham said unto God, Oh, that Ishmael might live before thee. So he didn't have Isaac at this point, and he said, well, let's forget about that. Let's go through my child by the bondwoman. And God said, Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant between him for an everlasting covenant, not between Ishmael and with his seed after him. Now we do know, by the way, that there were 12 princes of Ishmael, but they did not become tribes that scattered out over the whole earth. They remained in the Middle East, the Arab people and so on. And as for Ishmael, I have heard thee, behold, I have blessed him and make him fruitful. I'll multiply him exceedingly. 12 princes shall he beget, and I'll make him a great nation. But my covenant will I establish with Isaac, who only had 2 children, but the next generation down had 12. That was Jacob, which Sarah shall bear unto thee at a set time in the next year. So we know the great story there, where unfortunately the bondwoman and Sarah fell out, and they were banished into the... Sort of interesting, you think of Ishmael being connected to the Arab people. They sort of became a nomadic people, you might almost say, from that point. Later on, of course, the story of Isaac being offered, and Abraham believing that if he slew his son, God would have to raise him from the dead again because of the promises. We didn't get that far, thank goodness. 12 sons that later became 12 tribes, and particularly listed here in Genesis 35, came to pass that when Israel dwelt in the land, Jacob that is, that Reuben went and lay with Bilhah his father's concubine, and Israel heard it. Now the sons of Jacob were 12. Leah, Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, and Simeon, and Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. The sons of Rachel, Joseph, and Benjamin, the sons of Bilhah, Rachel's handmaid, Dan and Naphtali, the sons of Zilpah, Leah's handmaid, Gad and Asher. And these are the sons of Jacob, which were born to him in Paddan Aram. So what we do know later on is the tribe of Joseph split into 2. And he blessed Joseph and said, God, before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac did walk, the God which fed me all my life long unto this day. It's a great story of Jacob blessing the sons of Joseph. They have them as little boys there, but you look it up, they maybe weren't quite that small, but anyway, it doesn't matter. Famous story of where he crosses his hands and he blesses the younger. And we know that the birthright forever never went to who it should. We know the first one who should have received the birthright was Ishmael, and it didn't go to him, and it went through to his brother, Isaac in that case, and then Esau and Jacob, the same thing again. Jacob got the blessing, and then Reuben should have got it, but because he committed sin, it went through to Joseph, and then Joseph's sons, Manasseh, firstborn, it goes through to Ephraim. Amazing story. And the angel which redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads, and let my name be named on them, and the name of my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. So the blessing had gone through to Ephraim, the younger one, and it couldn't be changed, even though we know that jumped a couple of verses there, Joseph tries to change his father's hands onto the right heads, and his father refused and said, I know it, my son, I know it. He, Manasseh, shall also become a people, and he shall be a great, but truly his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his Ephraim's seed shall become a multitude of nations. And he blessed them that day, saying, in thee shall Israel bless, saying, God make thee as Ephraim and Manasseh. And he said Ephraim before Manasseh. So that's the basic story through to this point. We know that the great fulfillment of this story is Jesus Christ through the tribe of Judah. And sometimes people say that's the only fulfillment of this. Well, of course, we've got this one of Ephraim and Manasseh, got nothing to do with the line of Jesus. And that has to be fulfilled somewhere. Somewhere the children of Ephraim and Manasseh, one's got to be a multitude of nations, a commonwealth as we would call it, as has been known, and the other would just be a great nation. We link that to America. So later on, because we ended up really 13 tribes, it does all work out okay. So when they camped around the tabernacle, they break into their different tribes, and you would have thought there was 3 on one side, 3 on another side, and so on, but we ended up with 13. But Levi was not to have an inheritance. So they were in the middle around the tabernacle, and then the other 12 around. Next slide, I think, has got it better. So that's how they set up the tabernacle. And they're on the east, north, south, east, west. And on the west side there, you've got Benjamin, Manasseh, and Ephraim together. And up the north, you've got Dan, Asher, and Naphtali. And then on the east, you've got Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. And down the bottom, Gad, Simeon, and Reuben. And then around the tabernacle, the 13th tribe, which is Levi, they all camped around there. So it all worked out okay. You would have thought, make it into 13 tribes, it wouldn't work, but it did work. And then God, of course, then went on dealing with these people. And that's what we're mainly talking about today. Later on, when they got into the promised land, that's basically how it all fell out. And when they're on the other side of the east side of the River Jordan, before they crossed over it, some of the tribes said, look, we like it right here. Can we stay on this side of the River Jordan? That side, there's the River Jordan there, coming from the Sea of Galilee down into the Dead Sea. And Gad and part of the tribe of Manasseh and Reuben, they said, we like it over here, up against the hills of Moab. And then Joshua said, okay, we'll agree to that on one condition, is that you come with us until we conquer the rest of the land. And then once you've conquered the rest of the land, then you can go back and dwell where you want to. Well, Manasseh ended up being, as you can say, interesting. Manasseh represents America. It's almost the shape of America, isn't it? And that they had more land, as it were, than any of the others. That maybe represented they would be a great nation later on. Later on, when they split into 2 tribes and 10 tribes, well, Ephraim came to represent the 10 tribes and Judah represented the 2 tribes. But anyhow, that's basically how it broke down at that time. And then we have the divided kingdom at the time of Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, when he wouldn't take any good advice from Solomon's men. They will listen to the young men. They ended up being of the Lord, and they're divided into 2 tribes. Rehoboam down south, Judah and Benjamin made that up, and then there's the other 10 tribes here. From then on, that became 2 separate kingdoms. All the kings, starting with dear old Jeroboam, were bad, and they were all idol worshippers, and not many of the tribe of Judah were good. Many of them were idol worshippers as well. So the warning by the prophets of what would happen to the 10 tribes and what would happen to the 2 tribes if they didn't follow the Lord. So this at the time of Solomon, warning by the prophets, circa 1008 BC. But if you shall at all turn from following me, ye or your children, and will not keep my commandments and my statutes which I set before you, but go and serve other gods and worship them, then will I cut off Israel out of the land which I have given them. And this house which I have hallowed for my name will I cast out of my sight. And Israel shall be a proverb and a byword among all people. So there were the promises of what would happen, and there were promises as well as prophecies, that if they didn't follow the Lord, that's eventually what would happen. Warnings by the prophets. At this particular time, before the 2 tribes were taken captives, the 10 tribes were taken captive, and the main empire, the supreme empire at the time, was the Assyrian Empire, which went right through till 609 BC. Prophesied removal of the northern 10 tribes house of Israel. So that's what happened first. They didn't all go at the same time, and even the 10 tribes went at 2 different times. Partly north and south of the 10 tribes a bit later, but all under the Assyrian Empire. Babylon, of course, was the one, and later on the Romans were the one that dispersed the 2 tribes. Many prophets prophesied Israel's removal, yet the Lord testified against Israel and against Judah by all the prophets, and by all the seers, saying, Turn ye from your evil ways, and keep my commandments and my statutes, according to the law which I commanded your fathers, set to you by my servants the prophets. So I dare say the point is they were given lots of warning and they just didn't listen in the long run. Famous one from our fellowship anyhow, from verse 9 of chapter 9 of Amos, For lo, I will command and I will sift the house of Israel. Talking about the 10 tribes, by the way, among all nations, like as corn is sifted in the sieve, yet shall not the least grain fall upon the earth. So he's going to preserve this for later on, but he's going to sift them. Amos prophesied in 791 BC, right in the middle of the Assyrian Empire being the dominant one. So did Isaiah, mainly was in the time of the Assyrian Empire. Later on we have Ezekiel and Daniel and Jeremiah at the time of the Babylonian Empire, but this is the time of the Assyrian Empire. 10 tribes house of Israel rent out of the promised land. And the Lord rejected all the seed of Israel and afflicted them and delivered them into the hand of spoilers until he had cast them out of his sight. For he rent Israel from the house of David, and they made Jeroboam the son of Nebat king, and Jeroboam drove Israel from following the Lord, and he made them sin a great sin. And the children of Israel walked in all the sins of Jeroboam, which he did, and they departed not from them. Particularly the tribe of Dan was very, very bad. Until the Lord removed Israel out of his sight, as he had said by his servants the prophets. So was Israel carried away out of their own land to Syria unto this day. So these are the main kings of Assyria that took out the 10 tribes. So first of all, an amazing name, Tiglath-Pileser III. He came to power in 745 BC, and that very year, the beginning of his reign, he conquered the northern tribes and took part of them away. He conquered the northern tribes of the northern house of Israel, including Manasseh. So we date a great prophecy from that, 745, the 2520 prophecy goes through to 1776 when America was established. So particularly the tribe of Manasseh dates from 745 BC. Then Shalmaneser V replaced Tiglath-Pileser in 727 BC, and he then besieged Samaria, so the more southern part of the 10 tribes which had not been conquered. But he died in 722 before he fully conquered the city. And then Sargon II came to power, and a year later, in 721, he conquered the southern tribes there of the 10 tribes, in particular Samaria. In 727 BC, Sargon finished what Shalmaneser started. He destroyed Samaria and removed the last of the 10 tribes, including Ephraim. So we date The prophecies to do with Ephraim from 721 BC through to Britain becoming a great nation in 1800, 1801, the Union Jack and all that. That's the 10 tribes, goodbye. So they then migrate. They were only under the Assyrian Empire for a short time after that, because in 609 BC, it was over 100 years later, the Babylonians took over, and they were now already moving in that direction. But the authority of the Assyrians is gone. You might as well say the 10 tribes were free to roam wherever they liked. They were free to go. It was the 2 tribes that they mainly dealt with, the house of Judah. So the 2 tribes, house of Judah removed. And the big date we pick on there is 586 BC, when the city of Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians. And in the 5th month, on the 7th day of the month, which is the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, a servant of the king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem. And he burnt the house. Remember, it prophesied that, this house, the Lord said, I'll destroy it. At the time of Solomon, when it was built, he burnt the house of the Lord, and the king's house, and all the houses of Jerusalem, and every great man's house burnt he with fire. And all the army of the Chaldeans that were with the captain of the guard brake down the walls of Jerusalem round about. Now the rest of the people that were left in the city, and the fugitives that fell away to the king of Babylon, with the remnant of the multitude, did Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carry away. So 10 tribes gone well over 100 years before, and now we see the 2 tribes massacred, and Jerusalem broken down, and the walls broken down, and those who survived taken away captive. The time of Daniel, Ezekiel, Jeremiah. So now we're going to jump to the next kingdom, which is the Persian kingdom, Medo-Persian kingdom, which the Babylonian kingdom went for 70 years and finished in 539 BC. And then we see that the Lord stirs up directly between God and Cyrus himself. And he talks to Cyrus and says, I've called you to do a job. I want you to send somebody down to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. 2 Kings 19, and the remnant that is escaped of the house of Judah shall yet again take root downward and bear fruit upward. For out of Jerusalem shall go forth a remnant, and they that escape out of Mount Zion, the zeal of the Lord of hosts shall do this. So the rebuilding of the temple, and then later on under Nehemiah the wall, was very much of God, because he needed to repair the city and repair the temple and have, I think it was approximately 50,000 Jews come back to live there. Why? Because 400 years later Jesus was going to be born. And he wasn't going to be born into a city that was in ruins. He was born into a city that had been re-established again. So people came back from Babylon with the blessing of the Persian kings, one by one. There's a picture of Zerubbabel there. It talks about the plummet in the hand of Zerubbabel as they rebuild the temple. Ezra chapter 1 verse 2 records that, Thus saith Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord God of heaven hath given me all the kingdoms of the earth. Well, it wasn't Adelaide, it wasn't New Zealand, but the kingdom of the earth at the time was the Middle East, and that's often the case. A little bit confusing to some people, but the Persian Empire never did include Alaska. And he hath charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is there among you of all his people? His God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and build the house of the Lord God of Israel. He is the God which is in Jerusalem. You just wonder about these pagan kings, how much they believed and how much they didn't believe. Nebuchadnezzar often believed in the God of Israel, but he was still a pagan. And even people like Cyrus the Great, no great record of him becoming a Jewish convert, but he obviously believed in the God of the Jews. I'll read verse 3 again. Who is there among you of all these people? His God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem. I read all that. Verse 4. Whosoever therefore remaineth in any place where he sojourneth, let the men of his place help him with silver and gold, and with goods, and with beasts, besides the freewill offering to the house of God that is in Jerusalem. So that started around 537 BC, a couple of years after Cyrus became king. And you go through the book of Ezra, and the first 6 chapters are all to do with the time of Zerubbabel. who was of the tribe of Judah and of the line of David, but he was not a king, he was a governor. The kingship had gone. That had finished was Zedekiah. He died. But he then went, and Jeshua was the high priest, and they went down and they got involved in building the temple. Well, we know the story of how they laid the foundation, and there was great rejoicing. It talks about the old people could remember the previous temple of Solomon, and they wept as it were, remembering that. The young people didn't know that, and they just saw the new wonderful foundations laid, and they rejoiced over that. There was a great cry, you could hear it from miles away, a mixture of crying and laughing, or rejoicing as the foundations were laid. The only trouble is they stopped there. They all went home. They thought, that we've done our job. Now all they'd done is lay the foundations. And it wasn't until 12 years later, in 522 BC, that we have the prophets Haggai and Zechariah saying, consider your ways. Here's the foundations, maybe all weeds growing up amongst them. You haven't finished this house. And then it took another 6 years, and they eventually finished the temple. But the city was still in ruins for quite a few more decades, until Nehemiah came back and he said, right, the temple's lovely. Everything's about the temple, but everything around it is still in ruins. All the houses are still broken down, the wall's still broken down. And it was Nehemiah's job to rebuild the wall. So we jump right down to 450 BC, or around that time. Nehemiah rebuilds the walls of Jerusalem. The streets shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublous times. They had very little cooperation, if none, from the locals. And people like this guy, Sanballat and Tobiah, trying to do everything to stop it being rebuilt. And we'll read chapter 2. And when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the servant of the Amorite heard of it, it grieved them exceedingly that there was come a man to seek the welfare of the children of Israel. It's interesting, that statement, how that still really applies today. People don't like you going about trying to save people and give them happiness and set them free from all their troubles. They fight against that. Often parents said to their kids that came to the Lord, oh, I wish you were like you were before, still on your drugs and so on. Amazing, isn't it? That same attitude is there. Talk about Nehemiah. So I came to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. And I arose in the night, I and a few men with me. Neither told I any man what God had put in my heart to do to Jerusalem. Neither was there any beast with me, save the beast that I rode upon. And I went out by night, and by the gate of the valley, and even before the dragon well, and to the dung port, and viewed the walls of Jerusalem, which were broken down, and the gates thereof, which consumed by fire. And we know the great story of how he had a lot of difficulty, and he had to fight against people like these other people there, but eventually overcame. And Jerusalem was restored by about 408 BC. It was finally all back, lovely city, under the Persian Empire. There was no fighting at the time. That happened a couple of 100 years later under Alexander the Great. The Greeks overran the Persians and so on. But Jerusalem survived all of that. It was never, the temple was never destroyed again, and the walls were not broken until 70 AD. And that's another story. Herod's temple, by the way, was just a refurbishment of Zerubbabel's temple. So we jump through to the time of Christ, and we know the great story there in 30 AD when Jesus, about to die, sits on the Mount of Olives overlooking the city of Jerusalem, looking down on the temple. Helen and I have done that. It's quite easy to sit up on the Mount of Olives and look down on Jerusalem, and these days you see the Mosque of Omar where the temple was. You can sort of picture that from that day we were there. Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, see ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, tell us, when shall these things be? And right through to the end of the earth. So that was 30 AD. They've come back from Babylon, some of them have, been there for a few hundred years. They're going to now there be for about another 40 years, because that was a prophecy for what happened 40 years later, in 70 AD, and then eventually again, like the 10 tribes, this time really scattered to other nations. Luke 23, and there followed him a great company of people and of women, which also bewailed and lamented. And Jesus turned unto them and said, Daughters of Jerusalem, weep not for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming, the which you shall say, Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bear. It was the time of the destruction of Jerusalem. And that went on, as I said, from 40 years later, 40 being a big number in Bible prophecy, 30 AD to 70 AD, and again the final destruction of Jerusalem. 70 AD, the Lord saith, Because they have forsaken my law which I have set before them, and have not obeyed my voice, neither walked therein, but I have walked after the imagination of their own heart, and after Balaam, which their fathers taught them. Therefore thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, Behold, I will feed them, even this people, with wormwood, and give them water of gall to drink, or bitterness. And I'll scatter them also among the heathen. So the reason I've emphasised the word also is a reference to the 10 tribes which had already been scattered amongst the heathen. He then said to the 2 tribes, I will scatter them also among the heathen, whom neither they nor their fathers have known, and I will send a sword after them till I have consumed them. In Jeremiah 31 verse 10, Hear the word of the Lord, O ye nations, and declare it in the isles afar off, and say, He that scattered Israel will gather them, and keep him as a shepherd doth his flock. So we've got the depiction there of the destruction of Jerusalem, and the Arch of Titus in the Forum in Rome, picture of the carrying away the 7 golden candlesticks there, and the dispersion of the whole lot. So the diaspora, the dispersion of the Jews, scattered in all direction. And we know that Josephus made a comment, the historian at the time, there are but 2 tribes, the house of Judah, subject to the Romans, while the 10 tribes are beyond Euphrates till now, and are an immense multitude not to be estimated by number. Later on, with the isles afar off, the whole thought there, these people migrated northwest over centuries, and eventually immigrated into Britain and Scandinavia and so on. The time of a man called Rollo, he was a great Viking warrior, and he sailed up the River Seine and he conquered the city of Paris and had an agreement with the king of the Franks at the time that they could settle in France. And then a lot more came and they settled in Normandy. So it starts with this guy Rollo, and William the Conqueror was a descendant of him. So without following it all the way down, every person there, you've got Rollo right up the top there in 846 to 931, and then go right way down there, you'll find there's a guy called William the Conqueror in 1028 to 1087. So he was actually not French. He was actually of Viking heritage, and known as the Duke of Normandy, became the King of England and was the last of the tribes. So the brief story is that over a lot of times the Angles, the Saxons, the Picts and the Scots and the Jutes and all these people came in one by one and settled in parts of Britain and Scandinavia, particularly Britain, I dare say we dwell on. And then later on in 1066, the last came in under William the Conqueror. And after that, even though they were attacked many times by other nations, particularly France and Spain, and later on Germany made that attempt twice, it never happened. So again, just following all the way through all the different kings of England, queens of England, starting with William the Conqueror and right through, and different ones came and went. And then we have in 1776 the Declaration of Independence, when America breaks free from Britain and becomes its own nation. The British Empire in 1881, Union Jack, Union of Jacob, one king, one flag, one fleet, one empire. So the question we're asking today is, where are these people and what influence do they have today? Looking at Scandinavia as well, a lot of nations settled there. So going back to the question, the 12 tribes of Israel, are they relevant today? What I thought I'd do, there's so many different things you could talk about. What I thought it would do is some of the big things that have happened in the last couple of 100 years, and particularly what we call the Jubilees. Helen's been reading a book and discovered that really the more recent Jubilees, they go back to the 1500s, by the way. We won't go back into all of them on the Ottoman Empire, but particularly this time in 1867, which is exactly 50 years before 1917. We usually start with 1917. We see that this guy here, Warren, his name was sent to survey Jerusalem, and later on so that they could sell off the land. And when they needed the money, the Ottoman Empire suffered heavily financially in the Crimean War in the 1850s, and they were broke. And they found out they could sell the land in Jerusalem and surrounding areas, but they had to survey the land first so you could have a title. And it was this guy here in 1867, you might say from Ephraim, Jerusalem surveyed by Charles Warren. Warren, recruited by the Palestine Exploration Fund, the PEF, to conduct biblical archaeological reconnaissance with a view of a further research of an excavation to be taken later in the Ottoman Syria. So this particular guy we feel was pivotal to the start of the 50-year Jubilee. So it was 1867. The result was that when they sold off the land, it was when the Jews first started flooding back into the land of Palestine. They had no foothold before that time, maybe the occasional one here or there. But they started to sell off the land. A lot of Jews were there in 1917. That was the book that some of this came out of. Page 51 says, 2 years after the end of the Crimean War, 9 years before 1867, the Sultan enacted the Ottoman Land Code. 9 years after the first Land Code, 1867, the Empire enacted a new Ottoman Land Code. The land could be now purchased by foreigners. The land could now be purchased by the children of Israel, by the Jewish people. So that's a quote from that book. So we're going to just finish off our slides today, thinking about what impact have they had in recent times. We look at some of these great historic events, and they're divided each time into 50 years, starting in 1867 to 1917, the first 50 years, or the first Jubilee. And in 1917, which ended that first Jubilee, was the deliverance of Jerusalem. And as you know, we have a lot of slides on that. 9th of December 1917, we have the mayor of Jerusalem surrendering to the British Army, the great story of the light horse and so on. Then we have World War I. The point we want to make about the influence of the 12 tribes is on major events. They have been the champions of freedom. Whenever oppression came in, it was these nations, not saying they're perfect by any means, but God used, you might say, the descendants of the 12 tribes as the instrument of freedom and good and mercy and compassion, all those things that die out under oppressive dictatorial regimes. Britain and her empire combined with the USA were the main deliverers of Europe and the freedom that came from the end of the First World War. The Balfour Declaration came in 1917 also. That was from Britain promising Palestine one day to be a home for the Jews, without reading through all that. Second World War, Britain and her empire combined with the USA again, and can't leave out countries like Russia and China who were allies in the Second World War. They really did help massively, Russia did in particular, but they still seem to be the main instruments pushing to free people from the horrors, particularly of the Second World War, because of the destruction of the Jews and the death camps and all that, sort of beyond imagination, how evil and what hell's going to be like. That was where the devil, you might say, had a bit of a free rein for a while, and had people like the Nazis who hated the Jews. Maybe gives us a taste of what hell would be like, run by the devil. Then we have in 1948, of course, the State of Israel is declared. David Ben-Gurion declares the formation of the State of Israel in 1948. And it was actually the previous year in the House of United Nations, or League of Nations as it was then, they promised that it could happen, but it didn't happen until Ben-Gurion declared. War broke out the day he did that, by the way. And State of Israel is born. Its name is Israel. US recognises Jewish state. And of course later on recognises Jerusalem. So that was May 1948. We just see there from that time after the war, that's how the lines were drawn up. What you do notice is that where Jerusalem is, in punching a hole, you might say, to what we call the West Bank, where they had New Jerusalem, but they didn't have the Old Jerusalem. That was still part of Jordan. So Samaria and Judea, the old parts of Samaria and Judea, were under the Jordanian kingdom at the time. And what Israel was frightened of is, you can see the word Samaria there, where the S is, that between that point and the coast was only a very short distance. And the worst thing that can happen to any army or nation is to be divided. And they were fearful the Jordanians would break through to the Mediterranean Sea and divide the north from the south. It never did happen, of course. In 1967, of course, the recapturing of the old city of Jerusalem. Israeli Defence Force stormed Zion Gate, Jerusalem in 1967. And we're talking about the next Jubilee, aren't we? And that's how the Jews knew that it was a Jubilee. They blew the ram's horn, and the old rabbi standing alongside the Wailing Wall with the Israeli soldiers, and he blows the horn of Jubilee. First of all, we had 1867 to 1917, now we're going 1917 to 1967. So the Six-Day War. After 6 days, the boundary was very different, where they had actually captured the whole of the Sinai Desert and captured Gaza, West Bank, and the Golan Heights are all the new boundaries at that particular time. Later on, particularly after the Yom Kippur War in 1973, had an agreement with Egypt, and the Sinai Desert went back to part of Egypt. The Gaza Strip, though, the Egyptians said, we don't want that back. We'll promise that as a home to the Palestinians, which it is to this day, but a real hot spot, isn't it? Gaza always seems to be. The West Bank is still in great dispute, and the Israelis have said, we'll never give back the Golan Heights because strategically they could fire down on their people. So that was that particular Jubilee. And during that time onwards, we have a couple of peace treaties. Again, don't forget, the question is, what influence or impact do the 12 tribes have today? Well, this is an example of the impact of descendants of the 12 tribes. In the 50 years of the Third Jubilee, Camp David Accord led to Egyptian-Israeli peace in 1978. It credits Sadat, Begin and Carter, says this particular guy on the right, a professor of Middle East history, Kenneth Stein. Credit also has to fall on Kissinger, Nixon and Ford, so two presidents and foreign secretary. Interesting that he was a Jew, and yet he dealt quite well with both sides. He was more American than he was Jew, Kissinger. So these are the people that have influence on big events, particularly in the Middle East. Sadat, of course, lost his life because he did that. His own people rose up against him and felt that he should not have signed a peace treaty with Israel, and they assassinated him. Begin was actually previously known as a terrorist back at the time when the Brits were there. It was part of the early Israeli forces fighting Britain, trying to get them out. But later on he became the leader of Israel, and they signed this treaty here with Carter looking on. Might almost say you wonder whether Carter only had a one-term president, because, again, the popularity was not always there on things like this. Then a little bit later, Billy the Kid, he came to power. In the 50 years of the Third Jubilee, Yitzhak Rabin of Israel, President Bill Clinton of the USA, and King Hussein of Jordan again signed a peace treaty between these two nations. And both the way, they have held good. The agreement between the Egyptian and Israel has held good, and between the nation of Jordan and Israel, they both have held good. Often people sign these things and they don't hold good. A precarious peace, Israel-Jordanian relations, 1994 Israel-Jordan peace treaty, ushered in an unprecedented era of diplomatic relations, brokering peace between the Arab nations and Israel in ways previously unimaginable. King Hussein, of course, was really, as far as leaders go, the leader of Jordan, was a pretty good chap. British trained, and he married a British lady, very pro-Britain. The Jordanian army was mainly trained by the British army. So there was sort of, in amongst, it wasn't only the Jews at times, there were other people that stood out as quite spectacular. The Trump administration is preparing to update all US government maps to include the Golan Heights as part of Israel after the president formally recognised Israel's sovereignty over the territory. So right up until then, from the Six-Day War up until more recent times, nobody would recognise the annexing of the Golan Heights as part of Israel. It still belonged to Syria. But again, Trump, for all what we think of Trump, and I would imagine there'd be a variety of opinions here today, he was obviously an instrument, maybe not much different to people like Cyrus the Great, maybe an instrument in the Lord's hand to do a couple of major things to do with Israel. And even though it was an incredibly turbulent 4 years that he was the president of America, maybe these are the two great events that he was able to do. One was to recognise the Golan Heights being part of Israel, and later on, of course, the thought of Jerusalem being the capital. USA or Manasseh support the state of Israel, Judah, and Netanyahu and the president shaking hands there at that time. And then maybe the big one, which we really do feel happened in our time, in the last 5 years, the recognition of Jerusalem and the fact that it was exactly 50 years after the taking of Jerusalem in 67 cannot be a coincidence. The completion of the third Jubilee, 1967 to 2017. In 2017, the USA recognises Jerusalem as the capital of the state of Israel, and that can't now be altered. I've got down the side there, Donald the Great. And of course the Israelis struck this coin, and got all scripture there, and he charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem. We read that before in the book of Ezra. So that's a Jewish coin. In the background, behind Trump's head, is Cyrus the Great, and 70 years, and so on. So it's interesting the 70 years involved there to do with the completion of this recognition from 47 to 2017. So I just thought I'd make a couple other points in finishing. Descendants of the 12 tribes, nuclear powers, Britain, USA and Israel, all of them are nuclear powers. Ephraim, Manasseh and Judah are all nuclear powers, varying in punch, USA by far, but Russia, even though they've maybe got more nuclear weapons, would not be to the standard most probably of the USA. And I think when they had that conflict with Trump at the time over North Korea, and North Korea boasted that they were a nuclear power, according to this 15 nuclear weapons, and Trump rightly said, you got nothing compared with what we've got. But just the same, one nuclear bomb would be enough to start it all, wouldn't it? And China, I thought China would have more nuclear weapons, but 280 and so on in India. Some of these ones are because the other nation got it. So America got it, so Russia got it. And then China got it, being also supporting Russia. And then we have both Pakistan and India, who are enemies. Both had to have it in the end. And now we have, of course, France came in. And then, of course, we have Israel and the Iranians trying to get nuclear weapons as well. But that's the status quo at the moment. And as you can see, does the descendants of Abraham influence? Yes, they're massively involved in world events. The word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Moreover, thou son of man, take thee one stick, and write upon it for Judah, and for the children of Israel his companions. Then take another stick, and write upon it for Joseph, the stick of Ephraim, and for all the house of Israel his companions, the 2 tribes and the 10 tribes, and join them one to another into one stick, and they shall become one in thine hand. And when the children of Israel shall speak unto thee, saying, Wilt thou show us what thou meanest by this? And it's meaning that one day, they've got to be somewhere. That's the main point you make. They've got to be out there somewhere, the house of Judah and the house of Ephraim, or the 10 tribes, that one day they can be joined back together. And I thought I'd finish with this slide today. It got me thinking about the reign of our Queen. 70 years. the Babylonian kingdom. She reigned as long as the Babylonian kingdom lasted. So 609 BC to 539, our queen was over one nation for the whole time. When you think of all the different kings of Babylon came and went, and got nothing to do with anything, but just a little bit of pure trivia that I got thinking about that queen at that time. And then, of course, we'll wait for that. King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And all the people said, Amen.